Hello, friends, and welcome to the Games UX podcast.
A show that explores the world of user experience research in video games. My name is Leonard Nacker, and together with my co-hosts Anders Drachen and Pejman Mirza Babai, we edited the book on games user research. This podcast covers pretty much everything we couldn't fit into the book. Find out more about us on gerbook.com or grab the book from Oxford University Press.
Hey folks, just a quick word of advice. The Games User Research Book podcast is now the Games UX podcast. Same quality, same format, just a new name. Not always all three of us there, sometimes just one of us at a time, but we hope to provide the best content on Games UX just for you. Thanks for tuning in. Hello and welcome everyone to the podcast. Join us as we explore the challenge of crafting and evaluating user experiences in games and beyond. Today, we're not joined by our co-hosts, Pejman and Anders, who are away at a conference, but we have a GUR superstar with us today, Steve Bromley, a hardcore industry veteran and author of the books How to Be a Games User Researcher and Building User Research Teams, and much more. Steve could talk about that himself. But Steve, thank you for joining us today. Glad you're with us.
No, thank you very much for inviting me on. I'm really excited to have this chat today.
Excited that you're here. One of the things, let's start looking back a little bit across the last 5 years of games user research. What do you feel have been the greatest changes that we have actually observed as we are looking at the games user research in the past 5 years? How have we evolved as a field, and how have they changed in terms of what they want from that field and how they get into it?
That's a really interesting question. I guess one of the things that strikes me is the advancement of user research over the last 5 years in adoption at lots of companies. So perhaps thinking about 5-10 years ago, you're lucky if there was a single solo researcher in many games companies. Perhaps they had one or two people. Some people would do it on the side of their job. They'd be doing community management or QA and just a bit of user research. And instead, you've seen the growth of huge teams at big AAA companies that have really taken advantage of recognizing the value of research. What's been really nice is that recognition has meant that researchers have been able to move earlier in the development process. From a few years ago, we might have just been doing usability testing, a bit difficulty balancing at the end of development. You can see that change as teams get more invested and more interested in using research earlier for prototyping, for finding the fun of the game, and moving beyond just that usability testing. There's a really nice example from Bungie and the work Bungie have been doing, where John Hobson's got a graph of the time he was with Bungie. When he was working on Halo 2, it did maybe 3 or 4 usability tests in the last couple of months of development. Halo 3, about a year before launch, they started doing usability tests and other sorts of user research studies. And then for Destiny, it was 4 years before the game launched that they started doing this iterative development, iterative user research. And I think that adoption by the studios has been a big change over the last 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we're seeing, a little bit more professionalization as well, like people, seeking more advanced degrees and things like that. And I think, one of the things that I want to ask along those lines is, do you actually feel that we as a field are having more impact than we had, let's say, 5 years ago? Are we changing games more visibly than what we used to do? And how do we do that?
I'd like to hope so. And I wonder if it isn't necessarily because of those technical skills. It's not because people are doing more PhDs or getting more advanced in data science. Instead, I think what I've seen in the field is more recognition of the value of the soft skills of user research. Just us as researchers spending time with our designers, with our producers, understanding exactly what they do and how game development works, and then working out how we can fit in amongst that. It's very easy, and looking back on the mistakes I've made in my own career, to early on just think your job is to run the study and write a nice report and then just send the report to the team and say, well, told them the problems. It's their business now, whether they pick it up or what they do with it. And I think I've learned myself, and I've seen others have gone on the same journey, that actually that's only doing the half the job. If you're not spending the time sitting with the team before the study to understand the context, understand why they want studies, encouraging them to do studies at the right time, you're missing lots of opportunities when you could be running research. And if you're not doing that relationship building after you've debriefed, to sit with them to understand, did they understand the findings? Are they taking action based on them? Are they not taking action based on them? Why? That type of information allows you to iterate your own approach and work out, how do I communicate these findings better to our teams? And I think recognizing that side of it is why we have had more impact, and also has had a huge advancement over those last 5 years as researchers recognize the importance of those soft skills.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's a very nice angle to put it. And I do think this is one of the things, sort of this some of the decision-making skills that we have as user researchers are way more important. Now, if I look at your recent release, the Playtest kit, this is a Notion dashboard that you're selling, and you can talk about that a little bit after this. But one of the things that I like in there is you have this Playtest process cheat sheet, right? And this is kind of a nice way, I think, for people to understand some of these soft parts of the playtest at the very end. I think a lot of people are not so much aware of, okay, this is, these are the kind of playtests that I've run. Let's say in your example, you say it's 25 minutes, like short playtests, and then you want to present sort of these playtests to somebody pretty quickly after that in a debrief, right? Like deciding what to do next and analyzing it. I think that short turnaround, a lot of people coming from academia, they have sort of this longer turnaround. They're thinking about, these larger studies and not sort of that quick pace of, you've done something, now pretty quickly summarize it and decide on an action step. Like, what do you think about that and maybe that's not a soft skill, maybe that's actually a hard skill. Like, talking about it, I'm wondering, but like, how important do you think that is, this sort of action-oriented thinking that a games user researcher needs to bring to the table?
I think that's a very good observation, very astute. And I think it is very important and does combine both soft skills and actually being able to run research, like you say. What I found from industry is often that decision-making can be much messier than we anticipate. You might think there's just a single person who makes decisions and it happens, whereas actually the decision requires input from producers, from designers, from a programmer, from a creative director. All of these people need to come together and align on what we need to do next. And I think as researchers and as UX adjacent people, exactly as you said, we have the skills needed to help those conversations happen, to help do that divergent thinking that is very familiar for the design thinking process of assessing a range of options, but also those tools to then bring it back in. So make sure, hey, we've explored a whole bunch of ways we can approach this. We've assessed them rapidly and we've decided this is the approach your team's going to take forward. In industry, you find that process, although yes, it's true, you could spend months doing that divergent and convergent thinking, you can distill the core parts of that into an afternoon or into some short workshop activities with your team. And I think that's a really nice fusion of taking a lot of the ethos of academia and the skills academia have on exploring the problem space, but also making that into something practical. And yeah, I agree that's a skill that researchers need to get better at. And I have had to get better at in my own career as well.
Nice. This is actually a nice segue, which I guess I should have asked you at the beginning. Every good podcast host, you can see, Leonard just figuring out how to do podcasts here, but every good podcast host usually asks the guest at the beginning, what's your origin story? Where do you come from? But as you said, like, I've actually learned how to improve some of this. So Steve, like, tell me a little bit about your journey there. Like, how did you actually get from where you began? And I think I met you like 10, 15 years ago for the first time. Okay. So like, definitely you've been at a couple of different companies. You've worked at like not even like products that are not even games. And so you've done UX, I guess, from both sides, which makes you a person that's very astute at bringing these observations from traditional UX processes right into game UX processes. So Tell me a little bit about those learnings. And like, if we want to explore the future, we have to understand the past. So, what is the 10-year Steve Bromley, learning that you're bringing to the table that you're going to apply to your next 10 years?
Yeah, what an excellent prompt. So yeah, as you say, we've known each other roughly somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago. I was at university when I first became aware of games user research, and obviously your work in the field was one of the leading things out there at the time. Because I was very lucky and was exposed to Vertical Slice, a games user research agency in Brighton, I learned this existed as a career, and as you know, worked at PlayStation for 5 years as a user researcher. That was really exciting opportunity. It's a mature team, well established in their processes, and kind of taught me the basics of, well, beyond the basics, but the most efficient and optimal way of doing that usability style of testing, finding problems with the games and reporting them back to game teams, the bread and butter of what a games user researcher does. Where I think my career then took a tangent, and also to come to the future where I think there is potential for games user research to grow, is I started to recognize these outside of games, user research isn't just usability testing and that evaluative research of someone's got an idea or someone's made a thing and we're testing that thing. There's also a huge amount of work being done by user researchers in other industries to understand the problem space better. So not just test an idea that someone's come up with, but understand users in the real world, what they're really up to, and from that, recognize opportunities for new games, new mechanics, new features, and solve problems for people, whether it's with games or with technology. So in my work outside of games, I was learning how to do that and exploring that. But I've also been very lucky that I still work in games, I still work with a number of game studios. And from that, I see those opportunities for games to expand in this field. Games is very heavy on evaluative research and testing things. Because it's a creative medium and game designers are making pieces of art, it's not immediately clear how do we translate, why should we understand about users, or why should we understand about people outside of the context of games and the game that they're playing at this moment? What's the point of doing that, and won't it ruin the integrity of my artistic vision? A way I often use to describe this is, if you were making the Mona Lisa, you probably wouldn't do research you wouldn't imagine you'd do research before you made the Mona Lisa. It's hard to convey that. How do we apply that user needs thinking to making art? I do think there's a big amount of potential here. Not necessarily market research, not working out that kids like games about skateboarding this year, so we're going to make a game about skateboarding, but instead just learning, where are people playing games? How are they playing games? How does that fit into their life? And from that, working out where are the opportunities that we could be introducing new mechanics or new features to make that easier. I guess one example that jumps out to me from my own life is, and I guess this is a solved problem, but hey, I'm reasonably busy, don't get access to the TV that often because there's always something else on the TV, someone else is using the TV. It's hard to find time to play games. And then all the feature of the Switch where, hey, you can plug into a TV, you don't have to plug it into a TV, you can pick it up, you can carry it around with you, it works in other contexts. It's the type of thing I'm thinking where you can take that thinking of understanding how does that solve a problem and apply that to games is an area I think can do a lot more on games.
Love it. And you know what? It kind of brings me into this idea of frictionless versus frictionful design, I guess, right? Like this is something that we see a lot when we're in regular UX. It's all about removing the friction, right? Like making it so seamless or easy to get into the product. But yeah, in games, you're doing the opposite. You're designing for friction, but you kind of have to look at where the friction needs to be, right? The friction doesn't need to be in you picking up the technology, but the friction is in the actual design process. So I think, this is a really nice mindset that you're bringing to that from your journey, from working from these different companies. I think that's really cool. If you were to look back to some of the methodologies and technologies that you've been exposed to as part of your journey, which are the ones that you would say were most useful for you as you were kind of getting into your journey? Which are the ones that were easier to use at the beginning, and maybe some of the ones you appreciated much more 10 years later when you were a little bit more seasoned and exposed to it? And which are the ones you think are changing the most? I guess I'm, jam-packing 3 questions in here, but let's start with, the ones that were most useful and the ones, that were easiest and then maybe more appreciated later when you were a bit more seasoned in your approach.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I guess my own experience is, hey, I'm not a master of all methods. There's some that I rely on more heavily than others. All through my career, obviously, that basics of doing usability testing is both reasonably simple to do because it's just objective observation of what's happening in a game, and very useful for game teams, especially game teams at that beginning of the user research journey, because they don't know the benefits of doing more adventurous methods. You can immediately see the return on investment of, hey, we got some people to play this game. They didn't understand this bit. If you made this small change, it fixed the game. It seems both reasonably easy to do, but also, hugely valuable to teams. I guess as my career's gone on, it's the subjective ones that become more important. Talking to people about their motivations, exploring how to measure emotion, I think is going to become increasingly important, something that I haven't mastered. I've been reading, there's a book called The Playful Production Process by Richard LeMarchand, who worked on Uncharted and worked on The Last of Us. And he talks about how important actually that emotional goal is when they're making games, to think about, are we achieving the emotions we want? I think that's very messy to measure. I don't know how to objectively do that currently. But again, I think that's an area for both growth in the future and for new thought to go into it. And to take your question on a very slight tangent, looking at my own career and the things that I've learned and my perspectives have changed, I also recognize it's not just doing, I've said this earlier, but not just doing the study is the important part. It's how do you make people care about the study? The basics of, hey, let's allow people to observe the session. Let's make that easy. Let's make it relevant. Art is 101 in this area. I guess a lot of people are running observation rooms, but then all that work before with the teams to co-define objectives, or the work after the study to make it land and make sure it's understood and co-agree on actions to take. I've recognized that actually a lot of the value for having impact isn't just being able to execute on a study, it's making people care about it, which is the much harder bit. And that's a lot messier. It's a lot harder to teach. It's a lot harder to do. It requires strong emotional intelligence. It's a completely different skill set, and it's one that, again, I'm still on that journey to learn. But I think that's something that's important for people to develop too.
I think that, that's not even a tangent. I think that's a really important thing for people to watch out for, as it relates really to everything that you do as a games user researcher. It's good if you yourselves are having those insights and if you're processing this, but it is much harder to be able to bring that passion that you're feeling as you're fixing the game to the rest of the team, specifically not to, single anyone out or be very critical, but some designers might feel very attached to an idea. So it's very hard in that moment to convince the designer of the opposite, maybe because your users just do not agree with that original design intention.
I agree entirely. And to paraphrase someone much smarter than me, what I've seen as I've spent longer with teams and gone up in my own seniority as well, is eventually only about 10% of the job becomes actually doing the work, doing the study. And then 90% of the job is making the environment where the study matters. And that requires, going into designers and understanding what they're doing and helping them raise their game to take advantage of research insights, working with producers, helping them be in a situation where they can take advantage of research insights. So just becoming more multidisciplinary and helping your colleagues in other disciplines becomes increasingly important to actually make a change.
I really love that notion of the user researcher needs to be interdisciplinary at heart. It's really like one of those key requirements. You need to be somebody that, sees beyond the realm of the subject or field that you've originally been taught. And you need to learn the different languages, right? Like back when I studied game design, a lot of it was Greg Kostikian's early article, I Have No Words and I Must Design, which was such a wonderful example of that, early problem in game design, which since then Raf Koster and other people have introduced some of these, languages and seeing game design as a language and seeing any sort of design as a way or as a way to understand a design, seeing it as a language, seeing it as a composition like that. And I think that's a really beautiful way, and even though this might be a bit of a tangent, but it's a really beautiful way to kind of look at that. That even as UX researchers, we might be in the same position that design was 10 years ago. We still need to create a more coherent language sometimes, just to be able to communicate efficiently and effectively with our teams. Do you think that I'm onto something here? Or, yeah.
Yeah, and a really small example of that I bump into all the time is the idea of playtesting, the word playtest. That means a huge amount of different things to a huge amount of different audiences. For some, it's just the idea of, hey, I made this thing and now I'm just going to play the thing I've made to see if I like what I've made, to all the way to what a user researcher would recognize as, we're doing a structured study, we've got some objectives, we're answering those research objectives, we're analyzing the data, and coming up with a coherent language for what we're doing, making sure that language is understood across the teams we're working with, again, is a prerequisite to advancing our discipline, I think.
Yeah, and you know what? This is kind of leading me into an area that might be opening a can of worms. But one of the things that I'm wondering about is social responsibility of a user researcher, right? Like as accessibility and other areas are really growing in importance for games user research and making games universally accessible to people. What is our social responsibility? Also, as we're seeing, some reports from some games that are, and I don't want to single any game out, but some games are specifically targeted at generating money, right? Like they're at the very thin line between gambling and gaming. If we're looking at some outings in mobile and in casual games, very thin line. In Ontario, here in Canada, there was just a new regulation that now these short-term sports bets are allowed. So you can bet on everything that you think about during a sports game. So a lot of, of these casino makers and people are entering that gambling space. And they're, of course, benefiting from a lot of games user research knowledge as well. So it kind of begs the question, what's our social and ethical responsibility here as games user researchers? What do you think?
I think that's a fantastic point. And I guess another example that's coming up currently is the idea of crypto and gaming, or NFTs and gaming, where there are lots of studios trying to do Web3 and haven't quite worked out actually what is the value that we're offering here, and where is the game behind it. I think, as you know, because we're on the front line, we are the team, members of the team who spend the most time speaking to players and hearing stories from players and understanding the actual impact on the player experience on what we're doing. I guess that does make it a lot more pressing for us, where it's easy to forget if you're changing numbers in a spreadsheet or handing out tasks on Jira. It's easy to forget the impact that actually has on players and the decisions we're making. I don't think it's solely on us to make that change and to make studios care about that. But because we do have those unique tools, we are speaking to users more often than other people. We are in a position where we can do that. So I think often you do, exactly as you said, you see researchers care more about accessibility or care more about inclusion or care more about the social impact of games that are pseudo gambling or the environmental impact of cryptocurrency. So to some point, we get exposed to it. I think we're very aware of it. We've got a social duty to pass that on, but we can't do it alone. You need to because we're against capitalism, right? There's always that financial incentive to do the bad thing, and so we need allies to overcome that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm specifically interested in what you mentioned there with the NFTs and the things that people haven't quite explored yet. Will Wright, I think, tweeted a couple of weeks back, like he's somehow involved with some sort of NFT situation there. I don't know if it's through a studio that he's working with or something. I got to look up the tweet again, but it was something related to NFTs and really kind of thinking about, I think it really fits into strategy games, to be honest. There's, I think, a lot to be thought about when you're building resources or you're mining for a resource, you're creating something as part of the game. And obviously also for role-playing games and anywhere where you're using customization, then it becomes really interesting. But I think it's specifically interesting when you've actually put in the work to create something. And that means really like the same thing as mining a Bitcoin is like mining in a strategy game. You're mining a resource and then you're building something or you're creating something with that resource. And then it becomes interesting once you're thinking about, giving it a little bit of personalization and then being able to hold on to that. At least that's my understanding of NFTs. I'm not, the expert, but like that you can then sell that or fuel the game economy beyond just being a fake economy. Because a lot of games have economies. Let's face it. It's a big part of a lot of online games specifically. And so, like thinking about how can you tie that economy to real economical values to generate money, I think is an interesting problem. I've been sort of, negative about it. A lot of developers I know are pretty negative about NFTs, but this might also be because it's just too early for people to see the potential that's there. Because usually what happens if something really generates a lot of money, people will eventually catch on to it, no matter how evil it looks at the first place. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's hard to evaluate.
I think I have two thoughts about it, although again, I'm not an expert on it. I guess I've yet to see an application that couldn't just be replicated with a database. It doesn't need the fancy Web3 technology. It's like, hey, you could have a database that you query and transfer things. That's fine. And again, taking my experience from outside of games and tech, it feels like a lot of the NFT things is approaching product development backwards. They've got a solution, but they don't know what problem the solution is to yet. And yeah, there's a lot of market activity. There's a lot of interest in it. But I would feel a lot more confident as a proposition if you started with a problem, like we know we want to solve this problem and this is the solution to that problem, would be a stronger base. But hey, as you say, early days, hard to draw conclusions yet.
Yeah, and it could go either way. I mean, we've been burned a little bit with Facebook being a solution without a problem, and then turned out to be, not to offend anyone, hey Zach, but turned out to be a big problem with influencing people and advertising and really just being very cash focused and eyeballs on advertising and even like behavior change and changing people's attitudes of things. So it can get pretty risky pretty fast the more influence you actually have over people. So obviously you have to have a watchful eye over some of these technologies. And I think the interesting thing that you touched upon there is, I think any technologist, any designer in technology, any user researcher in technology has that responsibility. For far too long, we've just been designing things because we were cool or because we had an idea or because it was possible. But I do think it's just so important to train these folks, even if they go to university, if they take my classes. This is one of the things that we're thinking about when building a new UX program is we need an ethics class in there. We need people to actually think about these things as part of their education, because a lot of them don't. And they're just so focused on the methods, on the design, on all the nice and fancy and easy things. But ethics is a really hard thing because it really relates to your understanding of the world and the cultures. So I do think that's important.
Actually, you completely changed my mind by mentioning Facebook. Earlier I said, hey, we're exposed to it, but we don't necessarily have any more responsibility than anyone else on the team. I think, again, we are uniquely aware of the potential to explore and map negative impact to decisions we're making, especially big societal impacts, early in development, so that you don't just make it and then see what happens. And I think because we have that tool available to us, we have an ethical responsibility to encourage teams to do that, to explore, hey, what are the negative social impacts of what we're doing? You've completely changed what my mind from earlier.
Awesome. Well, there's a interesting outcome of our conversation here. We're kind of getting towards the end of our running time here. This has been incredibly interesting, and there's obviously lots more that we could dive into. For more on games user research, go to gerbook.com and check out the book, and also check out Steve's stuff that's available at. Steve, do you want to do a quick pitch where we can find some of your resources?
Yeah, of course. If you're interested in starting a career in games user research, the book, How to Be a Games User Researcher, is at gamesuserresearch.com. If you're just a developer and you just want to be better at playtesting and user research, check out the Playtest Kit at playtestkit.com. And thank you very much for inviting me on today.
Awesome. Well, Steve's books are excellent. I can vouch for that. I've used them a lot. I love the content on his website. I'm still not through his Playtest Kit. There's so much more content that I have to absorb and understand. So I'm really glad he's been producing all of these resources. So thank you so much for joining us today, Steve. And to our listeners, thank you again for listening today. We hope it was enjoyable and informative, and all the best to everyone.
This was another episode of the Games UX podcast.
Thank you for tuning in. Check out the Games User Research book with a blue cover published by Oxford University Press, the only research-backed book out there that provides an authoritative overview of UX research in games. Reading it will accelerate your growth as a game UX researcher so that you can achieve better results faster. Thank you to everyone leaving those 5-star ratings for the book on Amazon. Hey, even if you're not a games user researcher, our book will provide an instant opportunity for you to get an overview of UX in games. Check out Games User Research on Amazon.com. Send us your feedback anytime to editors@gerbook.com, and see you in our next episode.